from Alaska.
Madam President, I've come to the floor this afternoon to speak also about the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is S4. Listening to my friend from Virginia here describe some of the history that he and his family have lived through. Again, these are an important part of the discussions and the debate when we talk about one of the very cornerstones of our identity as an extraordinary nation, one of these principles of democracy and freedom, and those are fair and open elections. The Majority Leader filed cloture on the motion to proceed on Monday evening, and despite some very real reservations that I have, and it's fair to talk about those reservations, I will be among those who vote to begin debate on this measure when we have this vote in a few minutes here. And I will do so because I strongly support and I believe that Congress should enact a bipartisan reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. We have done that. Congress has done that 5 times since 1965, typically by an overwhelming margin here in the Senate. It's been about 15 years now since our last amendment to the Voting Rights Act, and I think it's fair to say that 15 years passage, it's probably timely and necessary to look at updates. And in order to do that, I think, Madam President, that what we have to do is we've got to step back from the partisanship. We've got to step back from the politicization that is driving this conversation. I think we should be able to agree to meaningful improvements that will help ensure that all our elections are free, they're fair, and they're accessible to all Americans. Now, those who follow this issue know that it's probably no great surprise that I'm involved in this discussion here today. I have been the lead Republican co-sponsor of a voting rights reauthorization now for the last 6 years. I've worked with my friend from Vermont, Senator Leahy, as well as Senator Durbin, Senator Manchin, and others to shape a framework that will allow us to make some progress on some very real and legitimate issues. And at this point, I feel that we've got a good foundation to help provide access to the ballot that is equal, again, for all Americans and free from any form of discrimination. We should all be able to support legislation to assure just that much, because nothing, as my friend from Virginia has said, nothing is more fundamental than the right to vote. Now, we've all heard that story of Benjamin Franklin being asked at the end of the Constitutional Convention about the type of government that the framers had designed, and his response, at least according to some sources, that it's a republic if you can keep it. And I recognize that one of the surest ways to lose our republic is to allow the public trust in our elections to erode. And I fear that that's where we are, is that trust, that faith in our own elections is eroding. So I've engaged on voting rights legislation because I want us to continue to reduce those barriers to Americans' ability to vote, whether it is geographic, whether it's logistical, we certainly know about that in Alaska, whether it's partisan or some other form. I think we recognize we've come a long way from the 1960s. I would certainly hope so. But I think we need to acknowledge that we can continue to build on that through reasonable and well-considered legislation. So the voting rights legislation that I support is not this sweeping overhaul that would take power away from the states in order to federalize the election process. There was a bill earlier on the floor this year, and I voted against that. I didn't like that, that very detailed, prescriptive approach that I felt was moving us towards a federalization. Instead, the legislation that I support would provide greater transparency for federal elections so that voters are fully informed. They know about the changes in voting procedures. It would protect voters from discrimination in all of its forms and continue to knock down the barriers that we know in many places still exist. It would provide protections for voters, for election workers, and polling places to discourage the efforts to interfere, to intimidate, or to physically harm them. It would provide for voting materials in relevant areas to be translated in our native languages. This is very important for us back home in Alaska. It would require states that have historically been found to discriminate against minority voters to once again pre-clear their changes in their voting laws. And it would uphold the many good practices and procedures that we have in states like Alaska, rather than burdening with new mandates that aren't designed for a place, again, like Alaska, where geographically, logistically, it just might simply not work. That's the kind of legislation that I can support. But I need to be clear here. That's not the description of S4, the bill that is being brought up for debate. I don't support S4 as it was written and as it was introduced. What I can support in its place and as a starting point is the substitute amendment that the majority has agreed to lay down should the Senate agree to begin debate. And that substitute amendment contains more than a dozen significant changes that my team and I have been working with others to negotiate. And so the question, I think, needs to be asked, is that enough? And I say no, it's not enough. Even with those changes, I still have concerns, and I know that many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle have concerns. Substantive changes will be needed before this measure is ready to pass the Senate. So if this procedural vote fails today, where I think we go next, we have to go back, we have to consider this legislation through regular order, through the committee process, and in the meantime, I mentioned just the politicization, the partisanship that we have seen with these issues. I think let's stop the show votes. Let's give ourselves the space to work cooperatively across the aisle to reach the level of consensus that I think is important. It's important for this issue. It's important for this country. The goal here should be to avoid a partisan bill, not to take failing votes over and over for political gain. It really doesn't get us anywhere. It gets us on record. It allows you to weaponize, if you will, a critically important issue. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't serve anyone. It ultimately accomplishes nothing. Our only real option here is to figure out how we're working together on this. And our goal, Madam President, should be to match what we did in 2006 when the last reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act passed the Senate 98-0. Wouldn't that be a goal for us all? Wouldn't that send the signal to people across this country, from Alaska to Maine, to have faith in in our electoral process, in our elections. Now, some may be wondering why, as a Republican, I'm willing to put my name next to this legislation pretty publicly, and in acknowledging it's not where I want the bill to be right now. But at this point, I think if we can step back from the political exercise, I think we can do good. I think we need to do good. I believe that those of us who want to find common ground need to be part of the process. We need to be willing to get in, mix it up, work it out, instead of sitting back on the sidelines and saying, I just don't like your product. And I'm not going to offer anything else. I just don't like your product. So let's get in the arena. Given my role as Vice Chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee, I believe that I have an obligation to help resolve some of the long-standing issues that face our Native peoples in Alaska and around the country. And finally, I believe it is simply dangerous to let voting rights become a wholly partisan issue where our divisions just fester and take root in an area that is so central to our system of government. So, Madam President, the vote in front of us today is procedural in nature on whether to open debate. It's not on final passage or anything close to it. There are even things in the substitute text that I frankly don't support, and others that I have not been able to fully evaluate. But I also recognize that the framework within the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is the most viable that we have, and it is the best starting point to legislate. So I will vote to begin this debate in the hopes that this is a step forward, not a step backward, as we're seeking a bipartisan accord. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent